The thunder of hooves split the air as Mabel Reed raced across the open plains of Wyoming Territory, her heart hammering as desperately as her horse's galloping feet against the hard, packed earth. The year was 1878, and behind her, the smoke from what had once been her family's homestead rose like a dark specter against the cloudless blue sky. "Faster, Star," she urged her mare, glancing over her shoulder at the distant figures still visible on the horizon. The Blackwell gang wouldn't follow her much farther. They'd already taken everything she had. Her pa was 3 years dead from fever, her ma 6 months after from a broken heart, and now the home they'd built with their bare hands was nothing but ash and memories. The wind whipped tears from her eyes as Star began to tire. Mabel knew she couldn't push the horse much longer. As the sun started its descent toward the rugged mountain peaks, she steered toward a cluster of cottonwood trees alongside a narrow creek, seeking shelter for the night. She dismounted with trembling legs, her cotton dress torn and smudged with soot, her dark brown hair falling loose from its pins. At 20 years old, Mabel had never felt so utterly alone. She tethered Star near the water and sank down at the base of a tree, finally allowing the tears to come freely. The sound of approaching hoofbeats startled her from her misery. She scrambled to her feet, looking frantically for somewhere to hide, but it was too late. A tall figure on horseback emerged from the trees, the fading sunlight glinting off a silver star pinned to his vest. "Miss, you all right?" His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that marked him as not being from these parts originally. Mabel stepped back, wary. "I ain't done nothing wrong." The man dismounted, his movements fluid and practiced. She could see him clearly now, tall and broad-shouldered, with tawny hair that curled slightly beneath his hat and a face weathered by sun and wind. He looked to be in his late 20s, and his blue eyes were kind but watchful. "Never said you did," he replied, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm Deputy Yates Blackwood. Folks call me Yates. I was riding back to Cottonwood Springs when I spotted the smoke. That your place that was burning," Mabel nodded, her throat tight. "The Blackwell gang, they came this morning. Said Pa owed them money, but Pa's been dead 3 years and he never borrowed from nobody." The deputy's jaw tightened. "Blackwells don't need truth to cause trouble. They've been terrorizing this county for months." He glanced at her thin dress, the single bag she'd managed to salvage. "You got family to go to." Mabel looked away, the familiar ache of loneliness threatening to overwhelm her again. "No, no one." "Well, you can't stay out here alone. Cottonwood Springs is just a few hours' ride. There's a boarding house there run by a widow named Mrs. Tillman. She's good people." "I haven't got money for boarding," Mabel admitted, shame burning her cheeks. Deputy Blackwood studied her for a moment. "Mrs. Tillman's always looking for help. She might take you on in exchange for room and board." Hope flickered faintly in Mabel's chest, quickly extinguished by doubt. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "That's what being a lawman means, miss, helping folks who need it." He gestured to her horse. "Can your mare make it a few more hours? We should reach town before full dark if we leave now." Mabel hesitated, her mind racing through her limited options. Stay here alone, vulnerable to the elements and the Blackwells' return, or trust this stranger with a badge. She stroked Star's neck. "She can make it." They rode in silence as the landscape transformed in the golden hues of sunset. Mabel kept a cautious distance between them, studying her companion from beneath lowered lashes. Deputy Blackwood sat easy in the saddle, alert but relaxed, occasionally pointing out landmarks or offering a brief comment about the town ahead. "Cottonwood Springs isn't much," he explained as they crested a hill and saw lights twinkling in the valley below. "But it's growing. Got a general store, a saloon, church, and schoolhouse, even got a doctor last year." Mabel nodded, trying to ignore the gnawing fear in her stomach. She'd never been anywhere but the homestead since her parents had settled there when she was 12. The thought of a town full of strangers made her palms sweat. "Mrs. Tillman's is just on the edge of town," the deputy continued, seemingly oblivious to her anxiety. "Nice, quiet place, respectable." The boarding house was a 2-story white clapboard building with green shutters and a wide front porch. Yellow lights spilled from the windows, and the scent of baking bread hung in the air. Despite her exhaustion and grief, Mabel's stomach growled audibly. A plump woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a neat bun opened the door at Deputy Blackwood's knock. Her keen eyes took in Mabel's disheveled appearance and the deputy's serious expression. "Evelyn," Yates said, removing his hat. "This is Miss Mabel Reed. Blackwell's burned her place today. She's alone and needs work and a place to stay." Mrs. Tillman's gaze softened. "Land's sake, child, you look half dead on your feet. Come in, come in." The next hour passed in a blur for Mabel. Mrs. Tillman fed her hot stew and fresh bread, clucking and fussing like a mother hen. The deputy explained about the Blackwells while Mabel ate, his voice low and angry when he described what they'd done. "We'll sort out the details tomorrow," Mrs. Tillman said firmly when Mabel started to droop over her empty bowl. "Right now, this girl needs sleep." "I'll check on you tomorrow," Deputy Blackwood said, settling his hat back on his head. His eyes met Mabel's, steady and reassuring. "You're safe here." For the first time since the Blackwells had ridden onto her land that morning, Mabel felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. True to his word, the deputy returned the next afternoon. Mabel had spent the morning helping Mrs. Tillman with laundry and cleaning, grateful for the work that kept her hands busy and her mind from dwelling too much on all she'd lost. "Miss Reed," he said, hat in hand as he stood on the porch. "I wondered if you might walk with me. There are some folks in town you should meet." Mrs. Tillman, kneading dough at the kitchen table, nodded approvingly. "Go on, girl. I've got things handled here." Cottonwood Springs was larger than it had appeared in the twilight. The main street bustled with activity, wagons rumbling past, shoppers moving between the general store and the butcher's, children darting about in some complicated game. Mabel felt conspicuous in her borrowed dress, too aware of curious glances from townspeople. "Word travels fast in small towns," Deputy Blackwood said quietly, noticing her discomfort. "Folks know about what happened to your place." "They're all staring," she murmured. "They're just wondering who you are. Once they know you, they won't look twice." He introduced her to the storekeeper, Mr. Jenkins, who offered her credit for necessities until she could get on her feet. The milliner, Mrs. Porter, mentioned needing help with sewing. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, Mabel's head was spinning with names and faces. Sheriff Thomas Granger was a bear of a man with a thick gray mustache and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened gravely as Deputy Blackwood recounted what had happened to Mabel's homestead. "Blackwells are getting bolder," the sheriff growled. "Need to organize a posse, run them out of the territory for good." He turned to Mabel. "We'll do what we can about your property, Miss Reed, but I won't lie to you. Without witnesses besides yourself, it'll be hard to prove anything." "I understand," Mabel said, though her heart sank. The homestead had been all she had left of her parents. As they left the sheriff's office, Deputy Blackwood touched her elbow lightly. "Don't lose heart. Granger's the best lawman in 3 counties. If anyone can bring the Blackwells to justice, it's him." Over the next few weeks, Mabel settled into life at Mrs. Tillman's boarding house. She cooked and cleaned, learned to serve the boarders their meals, and gradually began to feel less like an intruder and more like she belonged. Mrs. Tillman was stern but fair, and the other boarders 2 aging schoolteachers, a clerk from the general store and a young widow named Clara with her 5-year-old son, were kind enough. Deputy Blackwood Yates, as he'd asked her to call him, stopped by regularly, ostensibly to update her on the search for the Blackwell gang, but his visits soon became longer. He'd stay for supper sometimes, entertaining them all with tales of his days riding with a cattle outfit in Texas before he'd pinned on a badge. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the grass, Mabel found the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her. "Why did you really help me that day, and why do you keep checking on me?" Yates was silent for a long moment, his profile strong in the fading light. "I know what it's like to lose everything," he said finally. "When I was 19, outlaws hit our ranch in Texas, killed my pa and older brother, took everything worth taking." He twisted his hat in his hands. "I was in town that day, came home to find them gone and the house ransacked." "I'm sorry," Mabel whispered. He shrugged, but she could see the old pain in his eyes. It was a long time ago, but when I saw you there looking so lost, I couldn't just ride by. And now you've done your duty. I'm settled here. Yates turned to face her, his blue eyes serious. It ain't duty that brings me here, Mabel. Her heart stuttered at the way he said her name. In the weeks since the burning of her homestead, something had changed between them, conversations that lingered, glances that held. The way her pulse quickened whenever she heard his footsteps on the porch. Before she could reply, the screen door creaked open, and Mrs. Tillman called her inside to help with a sick boarder. The moment broke, but the memory of his words and the look in his eyes stayed with her long into the night. Summer arrived in full force, the Wyoming sun blazing down on the dusty streets of Cottonwood Springs. Mabel had taken on additional work at the milliner's shop 3 afternoons a week, her nimble fingers and eye for detail making her a valuable assistant to Mrs. Porter. Between that and her duties at the boarding house, she had little free time, but she found herself watching the clock on the days Yates usually stopped by. One sweltering afternoon in July, she was walking back from the milliner's when a familiar figure on horseback appeared at the end of the street. Her heart lifted at the sight of Yates, but as he drew closer, she could see that something was wrong. His face was grim, his clothes dusty from hard riding. "Mabel," he said, dismounting quickly, "the Blackwells have been spotted near the Murphy place, not 10 miles from here." She felt the blood drain from her face. "Are they coming to town?" "I don't know. Sheriff's organizing men now. I came to warn you." "What can I do?" "Stay close to the boarding house. Keep the doors locked." He hesitated. "I'd feel better knowing you were safe while we're out looking for them." Mabel nodded, trying to hide her fear. "Be careful, Yates." Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth that made her breath catch. "I will." The next hours were the longest of Mabel's life. She helped Mrs. Tillman secure the house, played quiet games with Clara's son to keep him distracted, and tried not to think about Yates facing down the men who had destroyed her home. The same men who had killed his family years ago in Texas, she was sure of it now, though he'd never said so directly. Night fell and still no word came. The boarders retired to their rooms, but Mabel couldn't sleep. She sat by the parlor window, watching the empty street starting at every sound. It was past midnight when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She rushed to the door, peering through the lace curtain. Relief flooded her at the sight of Yates dismounting, but it quickly turned to alarm when she saw how he moved stiffly, one arm held tight against his side. She opened the door before he could knock. "You're hurt." "It's nothing, just a graze." But his face was pale beneath his tan, and dark stains marred his shirt. Mabel pulled him inside, propriety forgotten in her concern. "Sit down before you fall down. I'll get water and bandages." "The Blackwells got away," he said as she helped him remove his vest and shirt. A long furrow ran across his ribs, still seeping blood. "But we drove them out of the county. They won't be back any time soon." Mabel worked in silence, cleaning the wound with steady hands that belied her racing heart. It wasn't as bad as she'd feared. The bullet had indeed just grazed him, but it could have been so much worse. "You could have been killed," she said finally, securing the bandage. "Occupational hazard." His attempt at a smile faded when he saw her expression. "Mabel." "Don't joke about it," she said fiercely. "I've lost everyone else. I can't." She stopped, horrified at what she'd nearly revealed. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested on the bandage. "Mabel, look at me." She raised her eyes reluctantly to his. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly, "not if I have any say in it." The weeks that followed brought change to Cottonwood Springs. With the Blackwell gang driven away, the tension that had gripped the town eased. The sheriff organized regular patrols, and Yates spent long days in the saddle, but he always returned to the boarding house in the evenings when he was in town. Mabel flourished under Mrs. Tillman's guidance, taking on more responsibility at the boarding house. Her work at the milliner's also increased, with Mrs. Porter teaching her to create hats as well as to sew them. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she began to think about the future as something to plan for, not just endure. By early fall, rumors began to circulate about Yates and Mabel. Mrs. Tillman, ever protective of her boarding house's reputation, took Mabel aside one evening. That young man has been calling on you regular for months now, child, she said, her tone gentle but serious. Folks are starting to talk, Mabel flushed. We're just friends, Mrs. Tillman's eyebrow arched skeptically. Are you now? Because the way he looks at you and the way you look at him when you think no one's watching tells a different story. It's complicated, Mabel sighed. He saved me when I had nothing. I don't want him to feel obligated. Obligation doesn't put that light in a man's eyes, Mrs. Tillman said firmly. You need to be honest with yourself, girl, and with him. The opportunity came sooner than Mabel expected. The following Sunday after church, Yates asked if she'd walk with him down to the creek that ran along the edge of town. The afternoon was crisp and golden, the aspens turning bright yellow against the evergreens. I've been thinking, he said as they followed the path that wound alongside the burbling water. About the future. Mabel's heart skipped a beat. Oh, Sheriff Granger's talking about retiring next year, says his joints can't take the cold winters anymore. Yates picked up a stone and skipped it across the water. He's asked if I'd consider running for sheriff when he steps down. That's wonderful, Mabel exclaimed. You'd make an excellent sheriff, you think so? His expression was uncharacteristically uncertain. I know so. You're fair and brave and people respect you, he smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Being sheriff means settling down, putting down roots. Is that not what you want? Mabel asked, confused by his tone. It's what I want more than anything, he said quietly, but not alone. The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Mabel felt dizzy suddenly, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Yates, I know it might be too soon, he hurried on, and maybe I'm a fool for hoping. You're young and beautiful and you could have any man in the county. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel the way I do. Mabel stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must hear it. How do you feel? He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Like I've been waiting my whole life to find you. Like everything that happened before all the bad and the good was leading me to that creek where you were sitting, looking so lost and so brave all at once. Tears filled Mabel's eyes as the walls she'd built around her heart began to crumble. I'm afraid, she whispered. Of what? Of losing you too, of not being enough, of her voice broke. No one ever stays, Yates. Everyone I've ever loved is gone. I'm not going anywhere, he promised again, reaching out to take her hands in his. Not without you. A tear slipped down her cheek. How can you be sure? You barely know me. I know enough, he said firmly. I know you're strong and kind. I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know the sound of your laugh makes my day brighter, and the thought of seeing you gets me through the hard times. He squeezed her hands gently. The rest we can learn together day by day if you'll give us the chance. Mabel looked down at their joined hands, so different, his large and calloused, hers small and nimble yet fitting together perfectly. I'm scared, she admitted again, of how much I already care for you. Hope blazed in his eyes. You do, she nodded, unable to deny it any longer. But what if it doesn't work? What if, Mabel, he interrupted softly, we can spend our whole lives worrying about what if, or we can take a chance on happiness. On us. As the autumn sunlight filtered through the golden leaves above them, painting dappled patterns on the ground, Mabel felt something inside her shift, a decision made, not with her head, but with her heart. Winter in Wyoming Territory was harsh, with bitter winds that howled down from the mountains and snowdrifts that sometimes reached the eaves of the boarding house. But inside, warmth prevailed. Mrs. Tillman had given her blessing to Yates's courtship, with the strict understanding that all propriety would be observed. He took his meals at the boarding house whenever he was in town, and on Sundays after church, they walked together regardless of the weather, bundled against the cold. Christmas brought a rare, peaceful spell. The town gathered for a celebration at the church, with pine boughs and red ribbons decorating the simple wooden pews. Mabel had spent weeks secretly sewing a new vest for Yates, dark blue with silver buttons she'd saved from her earnings at the milliner's shop. His gift to her was a delicate silver locket, clearly chosen with great care. Inside was a tiny portrait of her parents, painstakingly copied from the damaged photograph she'd salvaged from the homestead. How did you? she asked, tears welling in her eyes as she opened it. Sheriff found it when he went back to assess the damage to your place, Yates explained. It was pretty scorched, but the photographer in Laramie said he could work with it. Mabel clutched the locket to her chest, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. Thank you, she whispered. It's perfect. As winter yielded gradually to spring, change came to Cottonwood Springs. Sheriff Granger officially announced his retirement, setting an election for June. Yates declared his candidacy, supported enthusiastically by most of the town. His only opponent was a rancher's son with more money than sense and a habit of spending too much time at the saloon. Mabel threw herself into supporting his campaign, organizing a committee of women to bake for campaign events and sewing a banner to hang across Main Street. Mrs. Tillman watched her activities with knowing eyes but said nothing. On a mild evening in late April, Yates asked Mabel to ride with him out to a ridge overlooking the town. The wildflowers were just beginning to bloom, painting the prairie with splashes of color. He spread a blanket on a flat rock and they sat side by side, watching the sun begin its descent toward the distant mountains. "Remember what you said to me that day by the creek last fall?" he asked suddenly. Mabel flushed, remembering her tearful confession. "Which part?" "You said no one ever stays." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "I want to prove you wrong about that." Before she realized what was happening, he slid from the rock to one knee before her, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Mabel Reed, I've known since the day I found you that you were something special. These months getting to know you have only confirmed what my heart knew right away." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl. "I'm asking you to stay with me, to build a life with me. To let me love you for all the days we're given on this earth." Mabel stared at the ring, then at the man kneeling before her, this good, brave man who had saved her in more ways than one. All her doubts and fears seemed to fall away, leaving only the certainty that this was right. This was home. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes, Yates. I will." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to gather her in his arms. As the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Mabel felt the last broken pieces of her heart knit themselves back together. They were married in the church on a perfect June day, just after Yates won the election by a landslide. Mabel wore a dress of ivory silk that she and Mrs. Porter had worked on for weeks in secret, with a crown of wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Yates, resplendent in a new black suit, looked at her as she walked down the aisle as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever seen. Mrs. Tillman cried openly during the ceremony, as did Clara and several other women from town. Even Sheriff Granger was seen to wipe surreptitiously at his eyes when Yates and Mabel exchanged their vows. The celebration afterward was the biggest the town had seen in years, with tables groaning under the weight of food contributed by seemingly every household in Cottonwood Springs. There was dancing until dusk, with Yates spinning Mabel around the makeshift dance floor until she was breathless with laughter. As twilight deepened, they slipped away to the small house Yates had purchased on the edge of town, a cozy dwelling with a front porch and a view of the mountains. He carried her across the threshold as tradition demanded, setting her gently on her feet in what was now their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood," he said softly, his eyes warm with promise. Later, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, Mabel traced the scar on his side from the Blackwell gang's bullet. "I was so afraid that day," she admitted. "Afraid you wouldn't come back." "I'll always come back to you," he promised, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Always." In the years that followed, Yates kept that promise, even as his duties as sheriff sometimes took him away for days at a time. Mabel established herself as not just the sheriff's wife but a respected businesswoman in her own right, eventually buying the milliner's shop when Mrs. Porter decided to retire. The Blackwell gang was finally brought to justice 2 years after Yates and Mabel's wedding, caught during an attempted bank robbery in a town 50 miles west. The news brought a sense of closure, especially when the homestead land was officially deeded back to Mabel. They didn't rebuild the house. Their life was in Cottonwood Springs now, but they planted a garden there, and erected a small stone marker in memory of her parents. It became a place of peace rather than pain, somewhere they'd bring a picnic on fine Sunday afternoons. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, arrived just before their third anniversary. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. A son, Daniel, followed 2 years later, and baby Ruth completed their family when Hope was 6. One evening, as they sat on their front porch watching their children play in the yard, Mabel was struck by how far she'd come from that desperate day when she'd fled her burning home with nothing but her horse and the clothes on her back. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, noticing her pensive expression. "About the day we met," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "About how lost I was." He put his arm around her, drawing her close. "You looked like you were carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." "I was," she acknowledged. "I'd lost everything. I didn't think I'd ever feel whole again." "And now?" he asked softly. Mabel looked at their children Hope teaching Daniel how to make a daisy chain, baby Ruth toddling after butterflies in the golden evening light, and then back at her husband, his face lined now with a decade of worry and laughter, but his eyes still looking at her with that same warmth that had first melted the ice around her heart. "Now I have everything," she said simply, "more than I ever dreamed possible." Yates pressed a kiss to her temple. "Do you remember what you said to me that night when I found you by the creek, after the Blackwells burned your home?" Mabel frowned slightly, trying to recall. "I said a lot of things. I was terrified and grieving." "You whispered, 'No one wants me,'" he reminded her gently. "You thought you were all alone in the world." The memory came back to her, then the crushing weight of solitude, the fear that she would never belong anywhere or to anyone again. "And I lifted your chin," Yates continued, suiting action to words as his fingers gently tilted her face up to his, "and I said, 'I do forever.'" Tears filled Mabel's eyes at the remembered moment, that first flicker of hope in the darkness. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "And I always will," he vowed, sealing the words with a kiss as the sun set on another day of the life they'd built together, a life forged from loss and courage, sustained by love, and more beautiful than either of them could have imagined on that fateful day when a lost young woman and a compassionate lawman found each other on the wild Wyoming frontier.